Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning and good afternoon. The International Federation on Ageing and its partners SAGE and EGAL Canada are proud to present the latest webinar in a series addressing inequalities experienced by older LGBTQ2 people. The IFA would particularly like to acknowledge the financial support from Employment and Social Development Canada to deliver a series of 3 webinars on older LGBTQ2 people. We are pleased and happy to present the first of these webinars today, addressing older people's experience of ageism and age-based discrimination within LGBTQ2 communities. This webinar will discuss what it means to experience ageism and age-based discrimination as an older LGBTQ2 person, as well as specific challenges and strategies to overcome these issues. Just a note, throughout the webinar, participants will be able to submit typed questions through the GoToWebinar platform, and after both panelists have finished speaking, we will take as many questions as we can to ensure a robust discussion of this particular important issue. So just to talk through the webinar outline, introductions, a review of ageism and age-based discrimination. We have 2 fine panelists this morning, Dr. Brian DeVries and Ms. Kate Hazel, and then there'll be a lengthy question and answer period. For those that don't know, my name is Dr. Jayne Barrett, and I'm the Secretary General of the International Federation on Ageing, also known as the IFA, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. The IFA is an NGO in formal relations with the United Nations and World Health Organization. It is headquartered in Toronto, Canada, and our goal is to be the global point of connection of experts and expertise to help influence and shape policies that impact the lives of older people. Before I introduce our panelist, I would like to thank most sincerely my colleague, Ms. Hannah Girdler, who has put together this inspiring webinar today and is the person that's managing all of the technology behind us. So thank you very much, Hannah, for your guidance and expertise. The first panelist speaking will be Dr. Brian DeVries. Brian is Professor Emeritus of Gerontology at San Francisco State University with adjunct appointments at both Simon Fraser University in Vancouver and the University of Alberta in Edmonton. What struck me not only was Brian's extensive academic history and experience, but he was appointed to the Institute of Medicine's board on the Health of Select Populations Committee, which authored a most influential book, The Health of Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual and Transgender People, Building a Foundation for Better Understanding. The second panelist on this webinar is Ms. Kate Hazel. Kate is Specialist of Education and Training and Coordinator of older LGBTQ community programs at the 519. Kate draws on her background in therapeutic recreation and gerontology to foster the affirmation and resilience of older LGBTQ communities in care environments across Toronto and beyond. Kate is deeply committed to promoting intergenerational connectivity and spaces where people are supported in shared lived experiences. Just to give us all a bit of an overview on ageism and age-based discrimination. As the slide states, ageism is about negative and positive stereotypes, prejudice and/or discrimination against or to the advantage of people on the basis of their chronological age or perceptions of them being old or young. Most of the time in our field, in the field of ageing, we view ageism in a negative stereotype, but I think it's really important that we have a balanced view of what ageism and age-based discrimination is. Its stereotypes affect how we think about older people, prejudice affects how we feel about older people, and discrimination affects how we act towards older people. So, as the slide says, ageism and age-based discrimination is not only highly prevalent worldwide, each of us experiences it probably every single day of our life, but much of the time it's insidious and almost invisible to societal attitudes. It's pervasive, often socially accepted, and strongly institutionalised. With a rapidly ageing population, it is of the utmost importance and very urgent to better understand and, most importantly, combat ageism. It's my great pleasure now to introduce Dr. Brian DeVries. Thank you, Brian.
Hi, thanks very much. I appreciate you introducing me and the topic and being included in this. I have been asked to speak about some of my research in age-based discrimination and ageism, which has not been the focus, but has been apparent in so much of the work that I do. And so I'd like to just move over to my slides, which I hope I am doing now that you can see. Just move into to provide you some of the background, really, some context by which we could understand and examine the lives of LGBT older adults and the experience of discrimination. What I've created here is a fictional lifeline of, say, a 75-year-old LGBT person. So it's pretty broad, yet meant to illustrate the kinds of issues that an LGBT person would encounter, may have encountered over the course of their lives, and to give you a sense of, by the time we reach our later lives, the sort of experiences we've encountered and the context that that provides as we move into our very later years. For example, a woman who would become a lesbian in the course of her life or would identify as a lesbian was 12 when the first lesbian organization in the US began. An LGBT person was 23 when the first riots with what were then drag queens identified as trans persons in the Compton restaurant in San Francisco, and a few years later at the Stonewall Bar in New York City, heralding what many believe to be the onset of the LGBT rights movement. An LGBT person was 30 by the time the APA eliminated homosexuality from their list of diagnosable mental illnesses. Was 38 when the AIDS crisis first became apparent, and the development after that of protests, of really a movement that initiated in part out of the neglect of government and others in the care environment. Was 50 when Don't Ask, Don't Tell was issued by the Department of Defense, 53 when the Defense of Marriage Act was signed into law limiting marriage to one man and one woman, was 2003 when when sodomy laws were struck down. And so as you look across the course of this timeline, you see the critical events that have had a net effect on the lives of LGBT older persons, and that's what they bring with them into their later years as well. Those are related to the unique demographic characteristics of LGBT older adults, about which many of you, I'm sure, with which many of you, I'm sure, are familiar, but just if you let me highlight it briefly here, that we know from a wide variety of research, for example, that LGBT older people are much more likely to live alone. From national data as well as many local studies, there are higher rates of living alone amongst LGBT older adults than amongst non-LGBT persons. One national study found the difference was about 1 in 3 living alone amongst LGBT older persons compared to 1 in 5 In our study in San Francisco, it was almost 60% of older LGBT people lived alone, more than twice, really, that of older adults in general. And interestingly, especially the case amongst older gay men, who in our national boomer study were 4 times more likely to live alone. Related to that, LGBT people are also less likely to be partnered. About half of LGBT older adults from a national study are partnered, compared to 70% of non-LGBT older adults. And as was true of living alone, that is especially true for gay men. We found again in our MetLife study that 12% of the gay men had never been partnered, which was 4 times higher than the next highest subgroup of the population. So these characteristics also necessarily have an effect on access to support. For example, we found in our San Francisco study of over 600 LGBT people, 60 and older, that only 15% had children, far, far fewer than amongst the general population. But interestingly, and not so frequently asked, amongst those who have children, 60% reported that their children were not available to them. So they're more likely to live alone, less likely to have partners, less likely to have children, and less likely to have contact with such children. And as a consequence, more likely to turn to friends. And that's what we and so many others have found in large-scale studies. In this one, in our San Francisco study, again, for example, that almost 70% of LGBT respondents said they were more likely to turn to friends for a crisis or in times of need. You see the range of others to whom LGBT people would turn: partners, neighbors, friends, social services, faith communities, and within those groups, and I think this is an important distinction, that there are differences. And so the LGBTQ T groups, notwithstanding the fact, sort of grouped together under a singular label, there are many differences that we and others are now finding within these populations. And so amongst those turning to friends, for example, amongst those to whom individuals would turn for support, lesbians were more likely to turn to partners, for example, family and neighbors. Transgender people, evocatively, were more likely to turn to faith communities. And interestingly and consistent now, I think, with the other points that I've raised, gay men were more likely to say they have no one to whom to turn. So it's an especially vulnerable population, I think, older gay men, or certainly there's high rates of vulnerability within the gay male population. But looking to more specifically the experiences of discrimination, it's been much reported, but comparatively less studied. In our San Francisco study, again, recall of over 600 LGBT older adults, we asked of their experience of discrimination in the previous 12 months. The highest rates, and this is in San Francisco, of discrimination was almost 45% people reported being discriminated for their sexual orientation or gender identity. But the next highest was age, with almost 35%. So high rates of discrimination on the basis of identities and the basis of chronological or perceived chronological age. What's kind of obscured, I think, in this slide, but that's relevant, in a particularly relevant point, I think, is that we don't exist in only a singular category. Right? We are old and gay, for example, or old, gay, and a person of color. Imani Woody conducted a qualitative research study, primarily in the Washington, D.C. area, and I've included a quote here of an older lesbian who said, not only am I old, I'm an old lesbian female, and then when you add on top of that I'm lesbian, that puts you in the toilet. A pretty sad and dramatic statement, but really reflects the intersectionality of these sort of categories and the experience of discrimination. And I think that's an important point to recall. In a study that we are currently analyzing, in which we asked groups of around 130 LGBT and service providers of older adults, the extent to which they're prepared for later life and concerns about aging. I culled from those data some of the quotes that became themes, so they were sufficiently nominated, identified by individuals that they emerge not as a sort of unique statement from an individual of some of the experiences of ageism that they've encountered. Older gay men, for example, not infrequently spoke of ageism and really framed it in terms of kind of a Prince Charming culture as they identified it, saying that chances are pretty slim of finding their Prince Charming after 50, and that no one wants to be the close and intimate friend of a 75-year-old. So they're aware of and see that their age limits their access to others, including potential partners. Related to that was the experience of trust, is that a sense of mistrust really from older adults, those we interviewed, to those younger, and a concern of kind of being, quote, screwed over by younger persons, particularly in the very later years. Part of that, of course, has to do with the reduced access, the fewer numbers of those from whom they might seek support, and an inability to kind of develop that trust. And hopefully we'll hear a little bit more about that in a moment. Many of the groups spoke of the need to educate younger LGBT people, and gay men here specifically thinking of educating younger gay men. Lesbians similarly spoke of their experience of discrimination within their lesbian and bisexual women community, saying, here's a representative quote, that some of the younger people deliberately avoided speaking to us. You could feel it. It was like a curse. It hurt so much. So it's a sadly graphic statement of the personal experiences of neglect, of feeling abandoned, purely as a function of age within a community to whom others might otherwise turn for support. Transgender persons similarly spoke of their experiences of discrimination and ageism, with quotes not unlike what you've seen here, saying that, for example, growing old is not something that can be discussed amongst trans people. It becomes a joke. The community tries to erase aging. Related to that, several of the trans participants in our studies spoke of when you're old and trans, you get pretty lonely. And particularly addressed the cohort issue, which is not unlike what gay men addressed in the absence of trust, but here transgender people spoke of the different experiences of transgender individuals of different ages, saying, for example, younger persons transitioning today have access to different surgeries, hormones, and don't have the same experiences of having to pass. They don't have to apologize for who they are, which I thought was a poignant quote. And as a consequence, they believe that younger trans persons no longer want to identify as trans, is that they're better at being proud. And so they see the difference in their experience and feel alienated, that might be overstating it, but difference as a consequence. So that may not be ageism per se, but it certainly reflects the different experiences and sort of supports the ageism reported in the quotes prior to that. And the service providers recognize this as well with this pretty strong quote that the queer community is ageism on steroids. And that's what we hear not infrequently, even if there isn't the sort of strong basis of research to support that yet, at least empirical research, probably a lot of popular and colloquial comments of how ageism in the general population is probably exacerbated amongst an LGBT population, in part as a consequence of the different demographics that I described, that LGBT people live less intergenerational lives, and as a consequence, more within generational contact, limiting the contact between generations, making stereotypes, I think, more likely, and as a consequence, ageist kinds of experiences more common. The service provider similarly said that issues seem to be the worst for LGBT persons given their marginalization and being closeted, not unlike the sort of summary that I tried to just provide. I'm sorry, I can't seem to move to the next slide here.
Hannah, are you able to help Brian with the movement to the slides?
I am not. I can switch presenter view, but the slides
There we go.
You got it?
Okay.
Also, Brian, the slides are not currently showing on the screen. If you want to maybe click the button that allows that to be viewed. Yes, perfect.
Okay, thank you. Has that been true for my whole presentation so far?
Yes, but we'll just
yes, it has. Yeah, but Brian, well, do you know, sometimes it's better for us to listen. So okay. don't apologise. We've heard you. So please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So moving from the previous slide, then I hope what you see now is the other side of this is that notwithstanding the horrible and hurtful experiences of discrimination, of ageism, that there may be a flip side to that. It's a little bit of a lemonade kind of perspective, I fear, but I think illustrative of a deeper kind of construct that I hope we might think about. And this comes from a colleague of mine, Alon Myers, who kind of in a passing framework on a study asked a question at the end: what would your life be like if there wasn't any homophobia, racism, sexism, and perhaps we would add ageism to that? And as you might expect, LGBT people spoke of really how their lives would have been better, perhaps. They would have lived in a world where they wouldn't have been deprived of critical possibilities, where they would have felt safe and accepted. But here is the interesting piece, I think, is that they said it would have been a life without the opportunity to be stronger, to be focused, and to develop themselves in a way that these challenges required or mandated. That they would have had a life where they wouldn't have been able to create these communities that were really formed around oppression. And they wouldn't have been able to fight so strongly for social justice and equity. So they felt their lives would have been, if not impoverished, less enriched as a consequence of the experiences of discrimination that they have encountered. And so that I think is an important point to keep in mind as well too. And it leads really to the final point, for if I might, that together, it's not in any way to minimize the experiences of discrimination and ageism and all the other forms of oppression that LGBT, older adults in particular, have experienced. But I don't want to lose sight of the fact that many are here, thriving, contributing, and so there's something like a positive marginality that we might encounter. That's not my term, but it's a pretty elegant term, I think. The idea being that which hasn't harmed us ultimately makes us stronger. And in that strength, we've been able to create communities, become resilient, contribute to the world in ways that have really made a difference. And so it's not at all an ad for discrimination, segregation, racism, or any of those forms of oppression, but a recognition that in the face of those oppression, individuals have found a strength. And if we could look at that strength, I think there's much from which we could learn and understand more broadly the experiences, in this case, of older LGBT adults. maybe I'll stop there and apologize again for the fact that you saw mostly me and not the slides on which I work so hard to have available for you.
Well, look, thank you very much, Brian, but be rest assured that what you said was very meaningful, and the slides will be available to all of the participants, and so they will then be able to review and remember. You know, just a couple of notes that struck me was, you know, when you were talking about, you know, that older LGBT people, you know, have less involvement across generations, and that, you know, there is greater generational context. And, you know, I'd never really considered that framework in which an older LGBT person lives, and I think that's a very important, you know, frame for me to think. I think the other thing was, you know, the 3 points that you made right at the end around enhancing self-concepts and the development of community, and, you know, the fight for social justice and equity, which may not have been so strong if there wasn't, you know, some kind of discrimination. So discrimination not in a negative term, but in terms of it's enabled communities to form, to support one another, but also to be a force to enhance social justice. So, look, thank you very much. We will have some time for questions, but at this time I'd like to now introduce Kate Hazel. So, Kate will now continue the discussion and discuss programming and initiatives that can be used to fight against ageism and age-based discrimination in LGBTQ2 communities. Welcome, Kate.
Hi there, thank you so much for having me. Just want to make sure that my slides are visible right now.
You look like you're sitting in a very sunny room.
Yes, is that going to be a problem?
No, it looks great. No.
And the slides, are they visible?
No, not yet, but it's all right. Hannah will be able to help you. Hannah?
Yes, there should be a circle button with a screen underneath where the webcam option is. Yes. Oh, I believe it's on the little bar that pops up on the side where you could see presenters, things like that. The option to share your screen.
Has that changed?
No, it's still just seeing, we can see that, but we only see the web page right now, the connected to GoToWebinar, not your PowerPoint.
Is it visible now?
Perfect, yes.
Yep, well done.
Great, thanks for bearing with me here through these technical issues. Okay, so thank you so much for welcoming me as part of this conversation. I'm not a researcher or an academic, but what I have been brought on board to share a bit about are some case studies based on programming that I've been involved in coordinating. And it's really my pleasure to feature them here today, to be the person doing that, because they're intensely collaborative projects, and I wish we could have a full room of people represented for you to view. I also wish that I could see all of you tuning in. I'm just going to advance to the next slide here. Okay, so you were provided with a bit of an introduction to myself earlier. One of the hats that I wear here at the 519 Community Center is as a specialist of education and training, and that involves a lot of facilitation work in healthcare. I have been involved in training 5,000 healthcare providers at this stage over the last couple of years in older LGBTQ inclusion, and that includes mostly frontline workers, although some leadership team members as well. So we're talking about personal support workers, nurses, OTs, folks who are intimately involved in providing care for older LGBTQ folk. Oh, Sorry, somebody tried to get into the room. I'm sorry.
That's all right, Kate. Just keep going. No, it's no problem.
I'm sorry, I just have to pause to give them an update. 1 second.
Okay, no worries.
Sorry, Danny, I can't let you in right now.
It's absolutely okay, so keep going.
This is a community center, so
well,
a lot of people coming and going. My apologies.
Yep. Okay, so we haven't got your slides, so bring your slides back up again.
Are we back in action here?
Yep, we sure are.
Okay,
Perfect.
so great. So the 519, as some of you may be familiar with the 519 already, but I'm going to give a brief overview of what we're about. So we're a community center based out of Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And our mission is to meet identified and emerging needs of LGBTQ community members across the life course. So it's a very intergenerational space. The stats on the slide that you're viewing right now just give you an idea of the number of people who are engaging in programs and services over the course of a given year. So today I'm going to focus on expressly intergenerational programs, although we have a number of other programs which focus specifically on creating spaces and meeting the needs of older community members. But perhaps that's going to be another webinar another time. So the 519 has been a community center since the early 70s, but it didn't always have an LGBTQ focus to its service provision. Local mythology has it that that changed when a group of gay identified youth were seeking a space to hold the peer support meetings. And the request was put towards the board of directors at the time, which was incredibly controversial in a climate of much homophobia, biphobia, transphobia. But it was passed by one vote. And from that point forward, the 519 became a community center that was a safer space in the city of Toronto for LGBTQ folks. So why does the 519 put efforts into fostering LGBTQ intergenerational programming? There's a couple of key intentions noted on this slide. So one would be to challenge stereotypes, ageist stereotypes in many directions. So as Brian provided lots of substantiation for, there are many stereotypes that are run rampant in our communities towards youth and towards older folk as well. So as I've seen that expressed in my community work, sometimes that's the assumption that youth are not interested in hearing the stories of those who came before them. Another stereotype might be that older folk are not able to take on new learning. It's as well to promote cultural knowledge exchange, again, in many directions. So not only as shared by elders to youth, but really promoting multi-directional exchanges and new learning. Of course, to address social isolation, which is a huge issue for many members of our communities, and to expand possibility models. So what I mean by that is to create opportunities for example, youth to imagine their lives at various stages. There's so little realistic and exciting representation for LGBTQ lives in media and television. It really is quite limited. So getting folks of many ages together really expands those opportunities for imagination. And of course, there are many shared needs and concerns across age groups. Some of that might be discrimination as experienced through service access. Some of that might be alienation from family of origin, We know that family of origin is often the location through which people have intergenerational experience. So for people who don't have access to that, it can be really hard to cultivate. And of course, to create new forms of support to fill in those gaps that people might be experiencing in their lives. The chosen family is so important in that respect. And we have a number of programs which I'm going to talk about, which seek to create those networks of support. So people are checking in on each other and encouraging each other to engage in community activities. I'd like to encourage you as well to share some of your interests and motivations, maybe through the message function. Why do you want to foster intergenerational community programming? And also, what are some of the challenges that you've encountered if you've already been involved in delivering intergenerational programs, or some of the challenges that you anticipate if that's something you want to undertake? So at this stage, I'm going to share with you a number of case studies that have to do with intergenerational programming. These case studies have been crafted in consultation with many community members, so I am going to read them just to stay true to those voices and perspectives. The format of these case studies follows a few headings. One is purpose of activity, secondly, design and structure of activity, and then community impact. So starting with Tell It Like It Is. The 519 and the Senior Pride Network, which for those of you, if you're unfamiliar with the Senior Pride Network, it's an association of individuals and service provider agencies that are allied to the needs of older LGBTQ folk, planned and delivered an older LGBTQ lived experience speaker series called Tell It Like It Is. A committed intergenerational group of volunteers organized 5 public events, each on a community-identified theme of significance. The purpose of this program was to reduce social isolation and promote intergenerational connection through mutual understanding and cultural knowledge exchange. The 8-person organizing committee planned and delivered this program. The events took place on a bi-monthly basis between August 2016 and March 2017. Each event showcased the voices of LGBTQ elders, featured a youth and elder MC, and a local artist, and explored the following themes: chosen family, aging and disability, aging as a person of color, being trans and aging, and living a life of activism. The organizing committee made an effort to highlight intersectional identities and experiences and provided honoraria for contributors. The 519 partnered with local service agencies to support the attendance of local long-term care residents while providing personal support worker assistance, active listening, and childcare as needed. Refreshments were offered to everybody. About 400 people, at least half of whom were 50 years old, directly benefited from this project as attendees, guest speakers, artistic performers, volunteers, and organizers. It was important to the organizers to have community engagement at every stage of its planning and delivery, as well as meaningful relationship building and skill development, such as video documentation and social media. Participant feedback on this project emphasized the power of storytelling and the genuine curiosity and desire for connection that exists across generations of LGBTQ communities. I have some photos here associated with each case study, so I'll just give you a chance to appreciate those. So on to the next case study. This is Time After Time, which you might recognize as a particular song. So here we go. The 519 Senior Pride Network have collaborated on a series of elder-focused intergenerational dances entitled Time After Time. Since 2014, Time After Time has become a highly anticipated annual event within the LGBTQ community. The event strives to create a space of LGBTQ elders and youth where they can gather and celebrate their diverse lived histories while supporting the needs of elders within and outside the community. Each dance also serves as a fundraiser for the Senior Pride Network. A group of committed intergenerational volunteers from the 519, the Senior Pride Network, and the larger LGBTQ community has worked to design, promote, and execute each of the Time After Time events. Each event has had a theme that integrated historical queer tropes and elements of camp. For example, a John Waters-inspired Halloween party entitled Hello Queen, and a Mad Hatter-inspired daytime tea party entitled Queers in Wonderland. Most recently, Time After Time partnered with Pride Toronto and held its first ever Seniors Pride event entitled Time After Time, Then and Now. Time After Time's founders and co-chairs Leslie Lee Cam and Vanessa Dunn have worked to ensure that the diversity found within the LGBTQ community is reflected in each event through focusing their outreach, providing necessary accommodations, including ASL and personal support workers, and emphasizing the hiring of people of color and trans DJs and performers. Each Time After Time event has attracted crowds of between 200 and 300 community members and allies. On top of highlighting the needs of the elder LGBTQ community through the on-site presence and resource kiosks representing community organizations, the opportunity for LGBTQ youth and elders to share space and exchange experiences has helped cultivate much-needed meaningful connections. Time After Time continues to bridge both generational and knowledge gaps while celebrating our community, music, and the arts. So as you can see in these photos, so much joy happening here. Really a wide range of ages represented. We had a voluntary sign-in at the door to these events, so people could share information about themselves if they so choose. And the youngest person to come into the space was 2, and the oldest was 96. There's Leslie, one of the primary organizers, and really a great mover and shaker around the 519 and beyond. Okay, and on to another case study here. So respect your elders. The 519 developed an educational campaign and program that supports organizations and individuals in understanding the needs of LGBTQ older adults. Respect Your Elders is part of the 519's ongoing work to secure LGBTQ affirming environments for older people. Understanding that many LGBTQ older people have experienced a lifetime of discrimination due to their sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, they often encounter specific challenges and needs as they age. Due to an increased likelihood of social isolation and estrangement from families of origin, we wanted to highlight the need for community among LGBTQ older adults. Furthermore, due to the widespread belief that seniors are not sexual beings, the program highlights the need for intimacy among LGBTQ older adults. Respect Your Elders encourages dialogue about the needs for both community and intimacy as we age, and it aims to foster care environments that are respectful and affirming of LGBTQ older adults. Posters that emphasized community and intimacy were developed with input from community elders. Each concept shows 2 slides to highlight the differences that access to one's community and intimacy can have on a person's sense of self-worth and overall health. Taglines were crafted to underscore the role that older queer and trans people played in the rights our communities enjoy today, and to foster spaces, homes, and places of care in particular that are free from discrimination. Thousands of Respect Your Elders posters and educational resources have been disseminated to organizations serving older adults. Since all tools are available as openly online and via social media, it's impossible to know the full extent of the reach of this project. But I do want to make mention as well that all of these posters are available to you as open source documents on the 519's website under the Education and Training tab. So I encourage you to check those out after the presentation. You can download them, or you can contact us and we might be able to send you some copies as well. Another case study that I'd like to share with you is the Friendly Phone program, which has been running for quite a few years here at the 519. The Friendly Phone program was created during the summer of 2012 as a means to check in on participants of the 519's older LGBTQ drop-in program, as they were identified as at high risk for health concerns such as stroke and exhaustion due to extreme heat. Older LGBTQ community members are often highly isolated. Creating a weekly check-in program counters that by promoting affirming friendships and helping members remain engaged in community life and informed of events if they are unable to make it out to programming in person. The Friendly Phone program helps its members access information that they need to stay healthy, safe, and connected in later life. The Friendly Phone program started as a student-led community outreach pilot project. Mostly youth were involved in that. It now runs with the support of one placement student and a dedicated peer volunteer. And you'll see Gord depicted in these photos. The program is regularly evaluated with notes and resources maintained by program staff. Volunteers and students make the phone calls at a pre-established date and time from the 519. If the program participant does not answer the phone, the volunteer or student will leave a message ensuring that everyone gets a call and sharing necessary information. Having a consistent volunteer and student means that the long-term relationships of trust are developed. The program has evolved from simply being a conduit for information on extreme heat precautions to one where programs and services are being shared, and there's open and ongoing connection, care, and conversation. Volunteers with the program have engaged with participants through significant shifts in health, family relationships, aging, and life more broadly. Some participants are 90+ years in age, and for folks who may not have the resources or ability to engage with events or programs that require mobility, having a support that they can access from home is incredibly important. The program acts as a support for folks who have lost family, whose health may be deteriorating, or who may be adjusting to new access needs. The rapport, trust, and friendship developed between volunteers and participants are mutually beneficial. Students with the phone program have made unique and strong connections with some of the participants. Some participants will go out of their way to attend drop-in programming on the date that the student that they've been connected with is facilitating a workshop to show their support.
So, Kate, it would be great if we could have some time for some questions too. So, these
Absolutely. How much time do I have remaining?
Yeah, look, we've only got 10 more minutes before the whole session wraps up. So,
okay. So, with that in mind, I might wrap up my presentation. Suffice to say, there's a lot of activity happening here at the 519 and through our community partnerships. So if anybody wants to get in touch with me at a later time to hear more about those programs, ones that have taken place in the past or ones that are currently active, you're very welcome to reach out to me and get information.
Look, thank you very much, Kate. And of course, the 519 is a conference partner at the IFA conference in August this year in Toronto. And I know that 519 will be making presentations. So I think what was inspiring was, you know, some of the great examples that you showed, from the work of the 519. So thank you. We're now opening it up to questions, and I do have a question from Valerie to both Brian and also to Kate, and it really relates to, the services as well as levels of discrimination for older LGBTQ people in rural and remote areas. So, Brian, would you like to just kick off with your comments about, how living in a rural and remote area impacts, the life of an older LGBTQ person?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, and it's an area that's pretty poorly understood, although increasing in frequency in the numbers of studies. I'm working with a graduate student presently who's looking at the experience of aging of older gay men in rural settings in mostly Western Canada. What little we do know, I think, I don't even know if we know enough for me to be able to say what that experience would be like. The sort of small qualitative studies I have seen on rural aging amongst LGBT have mostly been on gay men, and within that context, it's a much higher degree of closeted experiences, and I would think so that the LGBT discrimination or fear of discrimination probably predominates, as we've seen, for example, that race discrimination in other contexts have predominated. You know, just in that intersectional way, there's many ways in which, sadly, people can experience discrimination. But I do think in more closeted settings that really is the sort of overarching structure and experience. It's not much of an answer, but I think it's an important area to study, and I appreciate Valerie raising that.
Thank you. And Kate, what about, you know, the outreach of the 519 into rural and remote areas?
Mm-hmm. So at this time, we mainly serve people who are able to make it to our program site here in Toronto. But we receive calls and emails from people beyond the city of Toronto seeking information about what's being offered here, how they might learn from our best practice models and observations in order to establish programming in their communities. So I'd love to bring to people's attention a new resource, a toolkit that features a lot of the case studies that I didn't make it to here today, along with some really practical tips on how to establish programming. That's on the 519's website. It's called Still Here, Still Queer.
Kate, I wonder whether we could, as part of our responsibilities, make a link to those and send them out to all of the attendees to this webinar, because I think they're valuable resources. And I also wonder about, you know, virtual programming at some time in the future. I just would like to raise another question from Elke Reesing, and it's to Brian. Our research group at the University of Ottawa is starting a research program on the preparedness of long-term care facilities, receiving a new generation of elders who wish to continue expressing their sexuality. And Elke is wondering whether, Brian, you could speak to your perception of LGBTQ elders and their needs and resources.
I wonder if that's particularly as it applies to long-term care.
Look, why don't you touch on long-term care? I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, that's so there. Again, there's a lot of colloquial sort of information available, not as much empirical. So I'm glad they're starting on that study, and I applaud them for that. There are a burgeoning number of long-term care, broadly speaking, settings developed around the US, in part because of the fear of discrimination LGBT people anticipate and colloquially have experience in long-term care settings. SAGE did a study on that not too long ago and found that like 80%, thereabouts, between 75 and 80%, expected to feel isolated, expected to feel shunned by both staff and other residents. And so I think there's high anxiety, even more than amongst the general population, of moving into such settings. And I think LGBT people are therefore less likely to do so in a more timely way. That is to say, wait until a crisis kind of emerges, at which time the centers available might also, the facilities available might also be more limited.
Yes.
There is a sort of myth of the affluent LGBT older person. The idea being that there might be the resources there to afford home care or services in somewhat more exclusive settings. Much of the data we have now shows that that is a myth, and that LGBT people are every bit and often poorer than those in the general population. And so the financial resources don't appear to be there in the sort of proportions that a myth might suggest.
Look, thank you for that. We have two questions that I'll pose to both you and Kate. The first one is from Manon, and the question is to Brian: how does disability affect older LGBTQ2 adults? And the second question, which can be taken, by either you or Kate, from Annette Danielle: how can healthcare providers in the broader community do better in supporting ageing members of the LGBTQ community? So, Brian, do you want to tackle this? I think it's a very difficult question around disability, because, I think the general population sometimes has the idea that older people are also people who with disabilities. So it's about this overlapping, isn't it? So perhaps you can tackle that one.
It is. I think it's another really great question, and I think your point is really well taken about the assumptions we have, or the extent to which we sort of experience disability and aging as overlapping categories. Excuse me. Karen Fredrickson-Goldson, who's really done an amazing amount and amazing research in this area, has one of the largest studies of LGBT older adults, and found that almost 2/3 report some form of disability. So it seems that there's higher rates of disability if we can believe these to be representative data, and I think there's some grounds for that. So there's higher rates of disability, I think, amongst LGBT older persons. And so it's an area of particular sensitivity, I think, and fits into this kind of intersectionality. On the one hand, I think an LGBT population might be more primed to appreciate these intersections within which members of their groups live. And on the other hand, we know that it's also an ageist kind of environment, and so I wouldn't expect necessarily that the discrimination forthcoming might be that much less. And so there's, again, not much of an answer on the basis of not a lot of data, other than a high prevalence of some forms of disability amongst LGBT older adults. And so they're sadly unfamiliar bedfellows, I think.
All right, look, we're coming to the close, but I would like to give each of our presenters a moment to, what is the key message, Kate, that you would like our audience to take away with?
Key message, I would really encourage people to think about intergenerational access when creating programming, and that relates to where programming is being held, what community hubs are being utilized, the time of day that programming is being held. And as for healthcare providers and what they might give some more consideration to, a lot of assessment tools that I come across when leading trainings in healthcare are really at odds with capturing the lived realities of LGBTQ folk. That might be due to an investment in binary ideas of gender, but it from the get-go is incredibly non-inclusive, and that follows people as they navigate the healthcare system. We've been talking a bit about long-term care. Certainly older LGBTQ folk face incredible barriers in long-term care. It's just at odds with their experiences and identities.
Okay, thank you very much. And Brian, your closing message?
Yeah, I mean, maybe building really on what Kate just shared too, that, you know, the demographics suggest that LGBT older adults are a kind of age segregated population. The qualitative data support that as well and speak of the kind of, if not mistrust, the uneasy alliances between or across cohorts. And so efforts that we can expend to sort of bring these groups together, I think enhance both and allow us to draw on what I think are the resources and untapped contributions of large numbers of LGBT older adults.
Look, thank you very much, Brian. So in closing, thanks again to our panelists and to our webinar participants that reached just over 100 at some times during the webinar. The webinar has been recorded and will be uploaded onto the IFA website as well as emailed out to participants. You'll also receive copies or links to the PowerPoint presentations and links to the toolkit and examples that Kate referred to. I just want to once again acknowledge the financial support received from Employment and Social Development Canada. This is one of a three-part series of webinars that have been supported by Government of Canada. And so you need to stay tuned for information about our next webinar on housing and residential care, an older LGBTQ2 person's perspective, which will take place in early March. If you have any questions, please contact Hannah Girdler, and her email is on the screen. And I want to thank panelists, participants, and most sincerely Hannah for her assistance throughout and also in the preparation. So have a good day, and thank you once again.